Commander Tai Yang looked out over the alien landscape and felt a strange mix of fear and wonder. The sky above Zephyr 7 was not blue like Earth's sky. It was a deep red color, almost like rust, and it made everything below look like it was painted in shades of orange and gold. 3 months ago, her team had landed on this planet, and since then, her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. The settlement was small but strong. Tai Yang walked through the base and saw the faces of her team. There was Dr. Ji-woo, who studied the plants and animals of this new world. There was Lieutenant Min-ho, who made sure everyone was safe and followed the rules. There was Engineer Dae-jung, who kept all the machines working. And there was Dr. Hae-won, her second-in-command, who watched everything with sharp eyes. But the most important residents of their settlement were not human. They were the Krell. The Krell were large beings, much taller than any human. Their bodies were covered in smooth scales that shone like polished stone. They had 4 strong legs and 2 powerful arms. Their eyes were huge and amber-colored, and when they looked at you, you felt like they could see into your very soul. They were intelligent, peaceful, and curious about the humans who had come to their world. The adult Krell had welcomed the humans and allowed them to build their settlement at the edge of a large canyon. Tai Yang had always been good with people. Her commanders back on Earth had chosen her for this mission because she could understand others and make friends easily. But she had never expected to make friends with an alien species. Yet somehow, that is exactly what had happened. There were 5 young Krell at the settlement. They were not full-grown, not like the massive adults that stood twice as tall as the smallest one. The oldest was about 16 months old in the Earth calendar. The youngest was barely 2 months old. The humans had learned to call them cubs because they behaved like young animals. They were curious, playful, and they loved to explore everything around them. One cub in particular had caught Tai Yang's attention. The female was smaller than the others but bolder. Tai Yang had named her Nara in her mind. She did not know if the Krell had names in the human sense, but Nara felt right for this brave little creature. Nara would follow Tai Yang around the settlement, making soft chirping sounds when she walked. Sometimes Nara would bump her large head gently against Tai Yang's shoulder, almost like a dog seeking attention. Over the weeks, Tai Yang had developed a special relationship with all the cubs. She would bring them pieces of minerals that seemed to make them happy. She would sit with them and speak to them in her soft voice. She had learned that they made different sounds for different things. A low rumble meant they were content. A high chirp meant they wanted to play. A sharp bark meant they were alert or worried. Ji-woo had warned her about getting too attached. "We do not know how they will behave," he said one evening as they sat eating dinner. "These creatures are powerful. What happens if they decide to hurt you?" But Tai Yang had shaken her head. She had felt something with these creatures that she had not expected to feel. It was not just trust. It was something deeper. She could see in their eyes that they were not mindless animals. They were thinking beings with feelings and emotions. When Nara looked at her with those big amber eyes, Tai Yang saw something like affection. And more than that, she saw belonging. Min-ho was more cautious than Ji-woo. "You are becoming too close to them," he warned. "It is not safe for you, and it may not be safe for them. There must be boundaries between us and them." Tai Yang understood his concerns. She truly did. She knew that getting close to aliens from a different world was risky. She knew that these creatures could crush her with one swipe of their powerful claws. But she also knew something that the others did not seem to understand. The cubs were not monsters. They were lonely. They were young, and they wanted to connect with something else. And somehow, they had chosen her. 3 months of living with the Krell had changed Tai Yang's life. She no longer saw them as strange alien creatures that needed to be studied and kept at a distance. She saw them as friends, more than friends, really. She saw them as family. But life at the settlement was hard. Every day brought new challenges. The work of keeping the base running never stopped. Tai Yang spent her mornings in meetings, making sure that every team member had what they needed. She spent her afternoons solving problems that came up. An important machine would break, and she had to figure out how to fix it. A supply shipment would arrive from Earth, and she had to organize how to use it. People would get sick or have accidents, and she had to make sure they received help. The pressure of keeping everyone alive and safe on an alien world was like a heavy weight on her shoulders that never went away. On the morning of the day that would change everything, Tai Yang woke up feeling tired. She had not slept well. Her mind had been full of worries and thoughts about home. She missed Earth. She missed the blue sky and the green trees. She missed her family and her old friends. She wondered if she had made the right choice to come to this distant planet. When she got out of bed and prepared for the day, she made a decision. She would take a day for herself. She would leave the base and go explore. She told Lieutenant Minho that she was going to look for a crystal formation that Daejung had spotted about 2 kilometers to the north. She said she would return before nightfall. Minho looked worried. But he did not stop her. He trusted her judgment. She did not tell him the whole truth. The Alpha Krell, the largest and wisest of the group, had made gestures to her that seemed to say she was welcome to go anywhere she wanted. It was strange, almost like the big Krell was giving her permission, or maybe even encouraging her. Tai Yang packed some equipment and tools. She would study the crystals. She would take measurements and photographs. She would collect samples. It was a good reason to leave the base. And more than that, it was a chance to get away from all the pressure and noise. It was a chance to be alone with her thoughts in the quiet alien landscape. As she walked toward the gate, young Nara approached her with a soft chirp. The cub's eyes were bright and curious. Tai Yang reached out and touched the small Krell's scaled head. "I will be back soon," she said, even though she knew the cub could not understand human words. "You stay here and be good." She did not know it then, but this simple gesture, this single moment of affection, would set off a chain of events that would change everything for everyone at the settlement. The cubs would wait for her return, and when she did not come back as expected, they would do the only thing they knew how to do when they were scared and confused. They would search for her with every bit of strength and intelligence they possessed. Consequences be damned. While Commander Tai Yang was exploring the beautiful crystal caves far from the settlement, something was happening at the base that no one had expected. The 5 Krell cubs had begun to notice that their human friend was gone. At first, this did not seem like a problem. The cubs had watched other humans leave and return many times before, but this time felt different. The cubs moved around the settlement in a group, their heads low, their noses to the ground. They were following a scent. It was the scent of Tai Yang, the human they had all become attached to. This scent led from the area where she had walked that morning, out through the main gate and toward the northern part of the settlement before disappearing into the open landscape beyond. Young Nara was the most agitated. She paced back and forth near the gate, making soft, whimpering sounds. The other cubs joined her, and soon all 5 of them were gathered at the boundary of the human settlement. Their amber eyes watching the red plains stretching out before them. Their ears swiveled, listening to the wind. Their sensitive noses took in dozens of scents from the air. Back inside the command center, scientist Yunji was the first to notice something strange in the data. She was watching the small sensors that the humans had placed around the settlement to monitor animal activity. The cubs were showing signs of distress. Their body temperatures had risen slightly. They were making more vocalizations than normal. Their movements were rapid and repetitive. Yunji pulled up a video feed from one of the external cameras and watched what was happening. The cubs were definitely agitated. She called over to Dr. Haewon, who was reviewing supply reports at a nearby desk. "Sir, I think there is a problem with the cubs," she said. Something is making them upset. Heywan walked over and looked at the screen. He could see what Yunji meant. The cubs were behaving strangely. Nara was repeatedly jumping and turning in circles. The larger cubs were walking in patterns like they were searching for something. What could cause this? Heywan wondered aloud. Engineer Dae Jung, who had been working on repairs in the corner, looked up from his work. Commander Tae Yang left this morning, he said. Maybe the cubs have noticed she is gone. Everyone understood then. The cubs had become dependent on Tae Yang's presence. They had formed what scientists would call a bond. And now that she was not there, they were confused and upset. How long can we expect this to continue? Heywan asked, looking at Yunji with concern. Yunji shook her head. I do not know, she admitted. The cubs are young, and they have never been separated from Tai Yang for this long. They may become more distressed before they calm down, or they may become calm very quickly. There is no way to know without more data. By midday, the cubs had moved from pacing to more active searching. They were no longer content to stay near the gate. They began walking around the entire perimeter of the settlement, their noses pressed to the ground, their eyes scanning everything they could see. They were looking for any sign of Tai Yang. On the eastern side of the base, Nara discovered something. It was a piece of fabric that Tai Yang had worn earlier in the week. The cub picked up the scrap in her mouth and immediately released a loud, high-pitched cry. The other cubs heard this sound and came running. Within seconds, all 5 cubs had converged on the small piece of cloth. They passed it between them, each one sniffing it carefully. The scent of their missing friend filled their sensitive noses. And this did something unexpected inside their young minds. Instead of calming them, it made them more determined to find her. They now had a concrete piece of evidence that Tai Yang had been here. And if she had been here, then somewhere nearby, she still existed. And if she existed, they could find her. The cubs began pulling at the outer covering of the eastern sector. They did not understand that this was the wall of the human settlement. They did not understand that inside was where the humans lived and worked. They only understood that this barrier was between them and where Tai Yang's scent was strongest. Nara's claws, which were as long as human fingers, scraped against the polymer material of the wall. The younger cubs joined her, and together they pulled and pushed against the structure. They made sounds as they worked, low growls and higher-pitched chirps that communicated their sense of purpose to each other. Inside the base, alarms began to sound. Daejung's sensors picked up significant pressure being applied to the eastern wall. Stress fractures were forming in the material. The impact was not devastating yet, but it was definitely causing damage. The cubs are attacking the wall, Lieutenant Min Ho reported, his voice tight with tension. What do we do? Heywan made a quick decision. We cannot hurt them, he said firmly. If we injure them, the adult Krell will retaliate. We need to understand what they want and find a way to help them without using violence. Yunji was already working on the problem. She pulled up her notes on Krell behavior. The cubs were young and emotional. They formed strong attachments to other living beings. When separated from someone they cared about, they would become distressed. This distress could lead to aggressive behavior, not because they were evil, but because they were scared. They are looking for her, Yunji said with certainty. They can smell her scent on the settlement, and they think she might be trapped inside. They are trying to help her. In their minds, they are not destroying the wall. They are saving their friend. Heywan closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing this information. How long until we have serious structural damage? At their current rate, maybe 3 hours, Daejung answered. The wall was not designed to withstand sustained pressure from creatures of that size and strength. The team gathered in the command center, watching the monitors as the cubs continued their desperate search. No one knew what to do. They could not communicate with the young Krell in words. They could not explain that Tai Yang was not trapped. that she had left on purpose, that she would return soon. The cubs could only understand what their instincts told them, and their instincts said that something was wrong, and they needed to fix it. Lieutenant Minho stood with his arms crossed, watching the cubs work with single-minded purpose. "When she gets back," he said quietly, "the commander is going to have a lot of explaining to do." But no one laughed. Everyone in the command center understood that this situation was becoming dangerous, and there was no clear way to fix it without using methods that might hurt the creatures they had come to respect and care about. The next few hours were going to be very difficult for everyone at the settlement. By the time the afternoon sun began to move toward the horizon, the situation at the settlement had become critical. The eastern wall was no longer just damaged. Large sections of it had been pulled away completely. The cubs had worked with surprising intelligence and persistence, and they had achieved what they came to do. They had opened a passage into the human settlement. But they had not found Tae Yang inside. Instead of accepting this and moving away, the cubs became even more frantic. They moved through the opening they had created and entered the settlement itself. Their massive bodies moved through the corridors and chambers, their sensitive noses leading them from room to room. They were searching everywhere, their desperation growing with each empty space they found. Dr. Haywan made the difficult decision to evacuate the eastern sector completely. All personnel were moved to the western part of the base, the furthest point from where the cubs were now roaming. The team set up emergency protocols and secured the vital systems. Power supplies were moved to safe locations. The water recycling equipment was protected behind reinforced doors. The food storage was locked away. Engineer Daijung worked frantically to keep the base running as the cubs moved through different areas. When Nara entered the biology laboratory, she did not understand what she was seeing. Equipment that Dr. Jiwoo had carefully set up for experiments was suddenly in the way of her search. Without any intention of destruction, simply by moving through the space, the young Krell knocked over delicate instruments. She pulled at cables because they smelled interesting. She moved storage containers to look underneath them, hoping to find the human she was searching for. Jiwoo watched on a security monitor as his life's work was systematically demolished. Equipment that had taken weeks to calibrate was destroyed in minutes. Samples he had been studying were scattered across the floor. He felt a pain in his chest watching it happen, but he understood what was really going on. This was not malice. This was love, or something like it. These young creatures were destroying his laboratory because they cared so much about finding their friend that they could not stop searching. Another cub focused on the ventilation system. These creatures were smart enough to understand that air moved through different parts of the settlement. If Tae Yang was not visible anywhere, perhaps she was hidden in the spaces where air traveled. The cub used its powerful claws to tear open ventilation shafts. Cold air rushed out from the systems that kept the base cool. Dae-jung watched in horror as crucial climate control equipment was damaged. "If that continues, we will lose temperature control in the western sector within 4 hours," he reported to Haiwan. The team had to make a choice. They could try to stop the cubs, but doing so would require violence or some method that might injure the creatures. And if they injured the cubs, what would happen when the adult Krell found out? The humans knew almost nothing about Krell family structure, but they could guess that the large adults would not respond well to harm coming to the young. On the other hand, if they did nothing, the base would suffer catastrophic damage. The life support systems could fail, the food supplies could be destroyed. The protective barriers that kept the humans safe on an alien world would be compromised. Minho stood in the command center with his hands on the weapons console. His training told him to act, to protect the base and the people inside it, but his conscience told him something different. "We cannot shoot them," he said finally. "I will not do it." Heywan nodded. "Then we protect what we can and wait," he said. "We wait for the commander to return." But as the hours passed, it became clear that Tae-Yang was not going to return soon. Her communication device had no signal in the cave system where she was exploring. She had no way of knowing what was happening at the base, and the cubs had no way of understanding that she was safe and coming back. All they knew was that she was gone, and their world was falling apart without her. Nara had moved to the central common area, the heart of the human settlement. This was where Tae-Yang had often sat with the cubs, teaching them about human culture, allowing them to rest their heads against her as she spoke in her soft voice. Nara circled the room, her nose to the ground, searching for some trace of her friend. Finding nothing, she released a sound that was part roar, part cry. It was a sound of desperation and confusion and pain. The other cubs heard this sound and responded. They came from their different areas of exploration and gathered in the common area with Nara. Together, they released vocalizations that echoed through the damaged settlement. The sounds they made were complex and layered. There were warning calls. There were distress signals. There were what could only be described as mourning sounds. To the human team huddled in the western sector, these sounds were heartbreaking. Yoon-ji had tears in her eyes as she listened to the desperate cries of the young Krell. "They think she is dead," she whispered. "They think something terrible has happened to her, and they are mourning." But even in their despair, the cubs did not stop searching. They began to dismantle the supply containers in the common area, pulling out bags and crates, sniffing each one carefully. They tore through the emergency rations looking for some sign of their friend. They moved systematically through the settlement, room by room, becoming more thorough and more desperate with each space they searched. By evening, the damage had become severe. The eastern sector was essentially destroyed. The biology laboratory was in ruins. The ventilation system was compromised. Power lines had been damaged. Water pipes had burst in several locations, creating puddles on the floor that reflected the emergency lighting. And still, the cubs searched. Lieutenant Min-ho made a grim report. "At this rate, they will reach the backup generator facility within the next 4 hours. If they damage that, we lose all power. Without power, we lose heat, light, and communication with Earth." The team sat in the darkness of the emergency lighting and waited. They waited for the situation to resolve itself. They waited for Commander Tae-Yang to return and explain to her furry friends why she had abandoned them. They waited and hoped that nothing else would go wrong before she arrived. But in the back of everyone's mind was a terrifying thought. What if she never came back? What if something had happened to her in the caves? What if the settlement was destroyed and the cubs were left to face the adult Krell with nothing but ruins to show for their search? It was a scenario no one wanted to consider, but everyone was thinking about it anyway. The crystal caves were a sight that took Tae-Yang's breath away. She stood in a large underground chamber where the walls seemed to glow with their own light. The crystals were not like diamonds or rubies. They were different from anything humans had ever seen on Earth. They pulsed with a soft blue light that came from somewhere deep inside the mineral structure. The entire cave seemed alive, glowing and breathing, creating a landscape that looked more like a dream than reality. Tae-Yang had spent the entire day exploring this wonder. She had taken measurements and photographs. She had collected samples carefully, placing them in secure containers. She had made notes about the formations and the way the light moved through them. Her scientific mind had been completely occupied with observation and analysis. But as the day progressed, she had also found something else in these caves. She had found peace. The weight that she had been carrying since arriving on Zephyr 7 had slowly lifted as she spent time in this quiet, beautiful place. The pressure of command, the responsibility for keeping her team alive, the constant need to make decisions that affected everyone around her, all of it had faded away. In the caves there was only beauty and silence. There was only the simple act of observing and appreciating something amazing. She did not think about the settlement. She did not think about Earth or her family or her old life. She thought only about the crystals and the soft blue light. She felt her mind clear and her heart lighten in a way it had not done in months. When the sun began to move toward the horizon, Tae-yang finally realized that it was time to return. She packed her equipment carefully and began the walk back toward the settlement. The red plains stretched out before her in the fading light. The alien sun cast long shadows across the landscape. Everything looked peaceful and quiet. As she walked, Tae-yang was thinking about what she had discovered in the caves. She was thinking about how she might present her findings to the rest of the team. She was imagining the look on Ji-woo's face when he saw the samples she had collected. She was planning the research project that could come from this discovery. She did not notice at first that the sky above the settlement was not clear. But as she got closer, she saw it. There was smoke rising from the base. Not the black smoke of a fire, but the gray smoke of dust. Something was very wrong. Tae-yang's peaceful mood vanished in an instant. The scientist in her was replaced by the commander. She began to walk faster. Then she began to run. Her equipment bounced against her back with each step. Her breath came in quick, hard gasps as she pushed her body to move faster toward the settlement. The running seemed to take forever, but it was probably only 15 minutes before she could see the extent of the damage. The eastern wall of the base was partially collapsed. Large sections of the protective barrier were simply gone, torn away and scattered across the red soil. She could see through the openings into the interior of the settlement. Tae-yang's heart was racing. Had they been attacked? Was there an accident? What had caused such destruction? She was still trying to understand what she was looking at when she heard a sound that made everything suddenly clear. It was a cry, high-pitched and desperate and filled with emotion. And immediately after, there were 4 more similar sounds. The cubs. All 5 of the Krell cubs came running around the corner of the damaged settlement. They were moving at incredible speed. Their powerful legs covered the red soil in long strides. But when they saw Tae-yang, they did not continue their mad dash. They slowed, their eyes widening with what could only be described as shock. For a moment that seemed to last forever. No one moved. Tae-yang stood on the red plain with her equipment still on her back, watching the cubs watch her. The cubs did not move. They did not make any sound. They simply stared. Then Nara released a sound that was part roar, part howl, part joy. She exploded forward, running directly toward Tae-yang with all the speed her young body could produce. The other cubs immediately followed, their own cries echoing across the plains. Tae-yang did not run away. She did not try to protect herself. Instead, she dropped her equipment and opened her arms. She understood in that moment what her absence had meant to them. She understood that she was not just a human visitor to them. She was something essential. She was family. Nara reached her with enough force that Tae-yang was knocked backward into the red soil. But she was not hurt. She was surrounded by the young Krell, their massive heads pressing against her, their bodies trembling. They were making sounds continuously, soft chirps and rumbling growls and occasional roars. They were sniffing her constantly, as if trying to confirm that she was really there and not some kind of illusion. Tae-yang put her arms around Nara and laughed even as tears ran down her face. "I am here," she said over and over. "I am here. I am okay. Everything is fine." The cubs did not understand her words, but they understood her tone. They understood her presence, and their panic began to fade, replaced by a kind of desperate relief. They would not let her move. They pressed against her, holding her down, making sure she could not disappear again. From the settlement, Lieutenant Minho was watching the scene on external monitors. He had been about to order emergency measures to protect the remaining systems. Instead, he saw something that made him pause. He saw the cubs surrounding a human woman on the red plains, and he saw, with sudden clarity, what this was all about. "Stand down all emergency protocols," he ordered quietly. "The cubs found what they were looking for." As the sun finished its descent below the horizon and the stars began to appear in the alien sky, Commander Tae Yang sat on the red soil with 5 young Krell surrounding her, pressing their scaled bodies against her human form. She was still holding Nara, and the young female cub was making soft sounds that might have been something like purring. Tae Yang thought about the caves and the beautiful crystals and the peace she had felt. But now she understood that true peace was not found in beautiful places or scientific discovery. It was found in connection. It was found in being needed. It was found in the simple, profound fact of being loved by another living being. The damage to the settlement could be repaired. The equipment could be replaced. But what these young Krell had expressed in their desperation could not be bought or manufactured or built. It was something real and true and irreplaceable. And as Tae Yang sat with her arms around the young alien creature, she finally understood what her real mission on Zephyr 7 had been all along. The Alpha Krell appeared on the horizon as the stars began to emerge in the purple sky. It was massive, much larger than the cubs, and it moved with a purpose that made even Tae Yang feel a moment of concern. The creature's shoulders were wider than the entrance to a human shuttle. Its head, when it turned to face the settlement, seemed to block out the light of the newly appearing stars. Inside the command center, Lieutenant Minho's hand moved toward the defensive weapons. "Sir, the adult is approaching," he reported to Dr. Hae-Wan. But Hae-Wan had been watching the situation carefully. He could see that the cubs were not afraid or agitated by the approach of the large Krell. Instead, they had made soft sounds, almost like greeting calls, when they first saw the creature on the horizon. "Hold your position," Hae-Wan ordered. "Do not engage unless there is a direct threat." The Alpha Krell walked slowly across the red soil toward where Tae Yang sat with the 5 cubs. Her team members watched on the external cameras, barely breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. This was the moment that would define whether the humans and the Krell could truly coexist, or whether they would become enemies. When the massive alien was about 5 meters away from Tae Yang, it stopped. The creature did not make any aggressive movements. Instead, it lowered its great head slowly, a movement that took several seconds to complete. The amber eyes, larger than a human head, focused on Tae Yang with an intensity that made her feel incredibly small. Tae Yang did not move. She did not know what this gesture meant. In her training, she had read about animal behavior and communication, but nothing had truly prepared her for this moment. She was a human woman, alone with 6 alien creatures, vulnerable and exposed on an alien planet. Everything she had studied and prepared for seemed suddenly inadequate, but then she understood. The lowering of the head was not a threat. It was a greeting. It was a sign of respect. Tae Yang slowly raised her hand and placed it against the smooth scale of the Alpha Krell's face. The creature's skin was warm and surprisingly soft. She could feel the pulse of blood moving through the veins beneath the scales. She could feel the living warmth of another being that had, in some way, given her permission to touch. The Alpha made a sound that was unlike anything Tae Yang had heard from the cubs. It was deep and resonant, like the sound of distant thunder. It rumbled through her body, and she felt it vibrate through the ground beneath her. But it was not a threatening sound. It was something else. It might have been communication. It might have been acknowledgement. It might have been approval. From the settlement, scientist Yoon-ji was recording everything. Her hands shook slightly as she worked the camera controls. "This is unprecedented," she whispered to herself. "This is contact, real contact between species." The cubs made answering sounds to the Alpha, and the large creature responded. It was clear that there was communication happening. a conversation of vocalizations and possibly meanings that existed beyond human understanding. The humans could only observe and try to understand what they were witnessing. After several minutes of this exchange, the Alpha Krell extended one of its massive arms toward Tae Yang. The movement was slow and gentle. The creature placed its large, clawed hand beside her, but not touching her. It was an invitation, perhaps, an offering of protection or acknowledgement. Tae Yang reached out and placed her small human hand on the Krell's palm. Her hand was impossibly tiny compared to the creature's anatomy. But the contact felt real and significant. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words or conventional communication. When Tai Yang finally stood up to return to the settlement, the 5 cubs moved to her sides, staying close. The Alpha walked along with them, a massive guardian accompanying the human and her young companions toward the damaged base. It was a procession that none of the human team members had ever expected to see. As they approached the entrance through the damaged wall, Min-ho suddenly understood something important. He looked at the collapsed structures and the torn equipment with new eyes. "The cubs did not destroy the base," he said aloud. "They were careful. Look. They avoided the critical systems. They did not touch the power core or the water recycling. It was systematic. They were searching, not destroying." Engineer Dai Jung pulled up the damage report and examined it with this new perspective. Min-ho was right. Despite the chaos and the apparent destruction, the cubs had somehow managed to avoid damaging the systems that were absolutely essential for human survival. It was as if they understood on some level that hurting these systems would harm the humans they cared about. The Alpha Krell did not enter the settlement. It remained outside, a silent witness, as Tai Yang led the cubs into the base. But its presence there, just beyond the damaged wall, made a statement that everyone understood. The cubs were not alone. They had the protection and approval of the largest and strongest member of their species. In the command center, Hai-Wan made a decision that surprised everyone. He ordered that the cubs be permitted to remain in the settlement. It was unprecedented. It broke every protocol about maintaining separation between species. It created risks that had never been calculated or considered. But it was also, in some fundamental way, the only decision that made sense. "We are no longer visitors trying to study an alien species," Hai-Wan said to his assembled team. "We are becoming something new, a community that includes both human and Krell. And if that is what we are going to become, then we need to act like it." Throughout the night, the team began reorganizing the settlement. The cubs were given their own areas where they could rest. Tai Yang sat with them in the central common area, speaking to them in her soft voice, telling them stories about Earth and about her life before she came to Zephyr 7. The cubs did not understand her words, but they understood her presence. They understood that she was there and that she was not going to leave again. Dr. Jiwoo looked at the ruins of his laboratory and felt a strange sense of peace about the destruction. Yes, his equipment was damaged and his samples were scattered, but something had been created in the process, something more important than any scientific discovery, a bridge between worlds, a connection that transcended biology and evolution and difference. By the time morning came to Zephyr 7, everything had changed. The humans and the Krell were no longer separate. They were no longer trying to maintain a careful distance. Instead, they had become a family, bound together not by choice or protocol, but by love and connection and the simple need to be together.